The emergency alarm screamed through the command deck of the Coalition flagship as another wave of Crethean destroyers tore through their defensive line. Captain Jake Morrison stood at the observation window of the human medical frigate, watching the battle unfold 3,000 kilometers away. Bright flashes of exploding ships lit up the darkness of space like deadly fireworks. Each flash meant hundreds of lives gone in an instant. The Coalition was losing badly, and everyone knew it. Jake had seen combat before during the Mars Rebellion 15 years ago, but that was human against human. This was different. The Cretheans were a species bred for war, standing nearly 3 meters tall with forearms and exoskeletons that could withstand small arms fire. Their ships were faster and their weapons hit harder. For 12 years the Galactic Coalition had been fighting them, and for 12 years they had been slowly pushed back system by system. Lieutenant Amy Brooks walked up beside him, her face pale as she watched another Coalition cruiser break apart under concentrated fire. She was 32 years old and brilliant with tactical data, but nothing prepared anyone for watching allies die by the thousands. The Valorian heavy cruiser they had been assigned to protect was now just floating debris. The Valorians were supposed to be the strongest military force in the Coalition. If they were dying this easily, what hope did anyone have? Amy handed Jake a datapad without saying anything. The numbers were worse than he thought. The Coalition had lost 60% of their fleet in this engagement alone. 60% in just 4 hours of fighting. The Sigma Quadrant was lost, and with it went any chance of holding the outer territories. Jake scrolled through the casualty reports and felt sick. 3 million dead. 3 million beings from a dozen different species all gone because they could not match Crethean aggression. The retreat order came through an hour later. What remained of the Coalition fleet turned and ran, limping toward the inner systems with damaged hulls and depleted weapons. Jake's medical frigate picked up survivors where it could, but there were not many. The Cretheans did not take prisoners, and they did not leave wounded enemies alive. They destroyed everything completely. Back at Coalition headquarters on the station orbiting Centauri Prime, the mood was darker than Jake had ever seen it. Admirals and generals from 17 different species gathered in the Great Council chamber, but nobody had solutions anymore. They had tried every conventional military strategy known to galactic civilization. The Cretheans countered everything. It was like fighting an enemy who knew all your moves before you made them. Commander Henry Cole, the highest-ranking human officer in the Coalition military, stood near the back of the chamber. He was 58 years old with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Henry had been pushing for months to let human forces take a combat role instead of just support duties. But the other species always said the same thing. Humans were too new to space warfare. Humans did not understand how civilized species conducted military operations. Humans were primitive and should stick to medical aid and supply runs. Jake found Henry after the council session ended, and they walked together through the quiet corridors of the station. Henry looked tired and angry at the same time. He told Jake that the council was talking about surrender terms. The Valorians had lost their homeworld yesterday. The Cretheans had bombed it from orbit until nothing lived on the surface. 14 billion Valorians dead in a single day. The other species were terrified they would be next. Ambassador Lisa Grant was fighting hard in the political chambers. She was 45 years old and had been representing humanity in the Coalition for 6 years. Lisa argued that Earth had 300 ships ready for combat duty and 2 million trained soldiers, but the Council kept refusing. They said human tactics were too barbaric. They said humans did not follow proper rules of engagement. Jake wondered what rules of engagement mattered when you were facing extinction. Everything changed 3 days later when the Cretheans attacked the Centauri system itself. 500 of their warships came through the jump gate and began advancing on the station. The Coalition managed to scramble 200 ships to defend, but everyone knew it would not be enough. The council chamber filled with panic as representatives from every species tried to evacuate. That was when Lisa Grant made her move. She stood in the center of the chamber and offered Earth's fleet with one condition. Humans would command their own operations without interference. The council could accept or they could die here when the Cretheans arrived in 6 hours. Elder Taven of the Valorians argued against it. He said letting humans fight would shame the Coalition. Lisa looked at him and asked if he preferred shame or death. The vote passed with barely enough support. Henry Cole received his orders within the hour. Take every human ship available and stop the Krethian advance any way possible. Jake was assigned command of the EDSF Defiance, along with 3 other Earth Defense Force destroyers. They had 6 hours to plan an engagement against an enemy force that outnumbered them 5-1. Jake sat in his ready room aboard the Defiance, reviewing everything the Coalition had on Krethian tactics. Amy worked beside him, analyzing battle records from dozens of engagements. What they found was interesting. The Krethians always fought the same way. They formed battle lines. They engaged enemies head-on. They valued warrior honor and single combat between capital ships. Every species in the Coalition had been fighting the same way for thousands of years. Formal lines, direct engagements, honor codes about targeting and weapons use. Humans had abandoned that kind of warfare 300 years ago. Earth's last major war had been brutal and dirty with no honor codes at all. Humans used ambushes and false retreats. They targeted supply lines instead of armies. They won by any means necessary because losing meant dying, and humans really did not want to die. Amy looked up from her analysis and met Jake's eyes. She understood what he was thinking. The Krethians expected the humans to fight like everyone else in the Coalition. They expected formal battle lines and honor codes. They expected predictable tactics that followed ancient rules of civilized warfare. Jake stood and called his officers to the bridge. They had 4 hours until the Krethians arrived, and he needed everyone to understand the plan. It was not going to be pretty. It was not going to be honorable. The other Coalition species were going to be disgusted, but it might just work. He brought up a tactical display showing the asteroid field near the 3rd planet. The Coalition fleet was forming up in open space, preparing for a traditional engagement. Jake's 4 ships were going to do something different. They were going to hide in the asteroids like pirates. They were going to hit supply ships instead of warships. They were going to make the Krethians chase them into traps. They were going to fight dirty. Amy asked if he was sure about this. The other species would call them cowards. They might even refuse to work with humans again after seeing these tactics. Jake looked at the casualty report still displayed on his screen. 3 million dead in one battle, because the Coalition kept fighting with honor. He made his decision. The Krethian fleet arrived exactly on schedule. 500 warships in perfect formation. They were beautiful in a terrible way. Dark hulls covered in weapons moving together like a school of predatory fish. The Coalition fleet moved to engage them in open space. Jake's 4 ships stayed hidden in the asteroid field and waited. The Krethians did not even notice them. They were too focused on the honorable enemy in front of them. The battle began and Jake gave the order. The Defiance and her sister ships came screaming out of the asteroids from behind the Krethian formation. They did not target the warships. They targeted the supply vessels and troop transports at the back of the fleet. Missiles and railguns tore into undefended hulls. 12 ships died before the Krethians even realized they were under attack from behind. Then Jake did something no Coalition commander had ever done. He ordered a retreat back into the asteroid field before the Krethian warships could respond. The enemy fleet began to pursue, but the asteroids made their formations useless. Jake's ships knew every rock in this field. They had spent 3 hours mapping it. The Krethians did not. 3 enemy destroyers followed the Defiance into a dense cluster of spinning rocks. Jake led them deeper and deeper until they were committed. Then he triggered the surprise. His ships had spent 2 hours planting mines throughout this section. The asteroids lit up with explosions. All 3 Krethian destroyers were destroyed. The rest of the Krethian fleet pulled back, confused and angry. This was not how warfare was supposed to work. Enemies did not hide and run. They did not plant traps. They did not attack supply ships instead of warships. For the first time in 12 years, the Krethians hesitated. Jake watched from his command chair as the enemy fleet repositioned. They had killed 15 Krethian ships and lost none of their own. The Coalition fleet in open space was getting massacred, but Jake's small human force had just won their first engagement. Amy was already planning the next strike. They had plenty more dirty tricks ready. The war was about to change completely. The victory at Centauri changed everything, but not in the way Jake Morrison expected. The Coalition command was furious with him. 3 admirals from different species came to the Defiance the next day, demanding to know why he had used such dishonorable tactics. Elder Taven called the mine trap a cowardly act unworthy of a military officer. Ambassador Lisa Grant had to intervene before they stripped Jake of his command. She stood in the conference room aboard the station and pointed at the tactical display showing the battle results. The main coalition fleet had lost 40 ships in that engagement. The human force had lost 0 ships and destroyed 15 enemy vessels. Lisa asked the admirals a simple question. Did they want to win this war or did they want to die with honor? Nobody had a good answer for that. Commander Henry Cole got Jake reassigned to the Outer Rim territories where human forces could operate with less oversight. The coalition was desperate enough to use humans now, but they wanted them far away from the core systems where nobody important had to watch. Jake took his 4 ships and headed out to the contested zones where both sides had been stuck in stalemate for 8 months. Lieutenant Amy Brooks spent the entire 3-day journey working on new tactical approaches. She filled Jake's ready room with data screens showing every Krethian engagement from the past year. The pattern was clear once you looked for it. Krethians always did the same things. They broadcasted challenge messages before attacking. They formed their battle lines the same way every time. They never retreated even when tactically smart to do so. They had honor codes that made them predictable. Amy told Jake that the Krethians were like ancient human samurai or medieval knights. They valued bravery and direct combat above everything else. The problem was that every other species in the coalition had similar values. They all fought wars like gentlemen having a duel. Earth had stopped fighting that way centuries ago when the last World War taught humanity that survival mattered more than honor. The Outer Rim territories were a mess when they arrived. Coalition forces held 3 star systems, and the Krethians held 5 with 2 systems contested. Supply lines ran through dangerous space, and both sides lost ships regularly to raids. The coalition commander was Admiral Vorath of the Kalari species, a veteran of 20 years who looked exhausted and defeated. He barely acknowledged Jake's arrival and gave the human ships patrol duty in the least important sector. That suited Jake perfectly. He did not want oversight, and he did not want to follow standard procedures. He gathered his captains and explained what they were going to do. The Krethians had a major supply depot in the contested Arcturus system. It was heavily defended with 20 warships and station defenses that could destroy a fleet. The coalition had tried 3 times to assault it directly and failed each time with massive casualties. Jake's plan was different. They were not going to assault anything. They were going to make the Krethians think a major attack was coming from one direction, while human ships snuck in from another angle and destroyed the supply depot's infrastructure. No honor, no direct combat. Just hit them where it hurt and leave before they could respond. Captain Ryan Hayes commanded the EDSF Warrior, and he loved the plan immediately. Ryan was 40 years old and had served in Earth's Marine Forces for 20 years. He understood asymmetric warfare better than anyone. His ship would create the diversion while Jake's Defiance and 2 other destroyers went after the real target. Dr. Karen Wells was the xenobiologist assigned to the Human Task Force. She was 36 years old and specialized in alien psychology. Karen had been studying Krethian behavior, and she discovered something interesting. The Krethians needed a specific type of water with high mineral content. Their biology could not process regular water for more than a few weeks. Every Krethian base had to have supplies of this special water, or the troops would get sick and die. Jake asked her if destroying those water supplies would be considered too extreme. Karen looked at him and said that letting the coalition lose this war and watching billions die seemed more extreme. She gave him the chemical composition of the water and where the storage tanks would be located on the supply depot. They executed the plan 3 days later. Ryan's ship came screaming into the Arcturus system, broadcasting false signals that made it look like 50 coalition ships were about to attack. The Krethian warships moved to intercept, forming their traditional battle line. Meanwhile, Jake's 3 ships came in from the opposite side using the system's asteroid belt for cover. They had learned to be very good at hiding. The supply depot was enormous, a station the size of a small moon with docking bays for 100 ships. But it only had minimal defensive weapons because the warships were supposed to protect it. Those warships were all chasing Ryan's ship on the other side of the system. Jake's ships emerged from the asteroids and opened fire on the water storage tanks. The tanks exploded in spectacular fashion, venting millions of gallons of mineral water into space. Jake's ships also targeted the processing facilities that created the water and the incoming supply ships carrying more. Within 10 minutes, the depot went from having 6 months of water supplies to having less than 3 weeks. The Krethian commander realized what happened and sent ships back, But Jake's force was already gone, disappeared back into the asteroid belt. Ryan's ship had led the enemy warships on a chase through the outer system, always staying just out of weapons range. When the Creathians finally gave up and turned back, Ryan left the system and met up with Jake at the rendezvous point. They had not destroyed the supply depot, but they had done something worse. They made it useless. Without water, the Creathians would have to abandon it, or bring in massive supply convoys that would be vulnerable to attack. Admiral Vorath was not pleased when he heard about the operation. He called Jake to his flagship and spent an hour lecturing him about proper military conduct. Targeting supply lines instead of fighting honorably was beneath civilized species. Jake listened politely and then showed Vorath the intelligence reports. The Creathians were already evacuating the depot. 3 star systems that depended on supplies from that depot were going to be weakened. The Coalition could retake territory without firing a shot at enemy warships. Vorath dismissed Jake but did not order him to stop. The other Coalition officers were horrified by human methods, but they could not argue with results. The stalemate in the Outer Rim was finally shifting in their favor. Over the next 2 months, Jake's small task force ran a dozen similar operations. They ambushed supply convoys instead of fighting warships directly. They used false retreat tactics to lure enemy ships into traps. They planted mines in shipping lanes. They broadcasted fake distress signals to draw enemies out of position. Every trick was something that violated the understood rules of galactic warfare. Amy developed a particularly effective tactic called the Ghost Fleet. They would program automated drones to broadcast the signatures of full battle cruisers. The Creathians would send major forces to intercept what they thought was a Coalition fleet, only to find empty drones. While the enemy was chasing ghosts, Jake's real ships would hit undefended targets elsewhere. Colonel Ryan Hayes took a Marine force down to a Creathian-held planet in the Omega system. The planet had valuable resources that both sides wanted. Instead of assaulting the fortified Creathian base directly, Ryan's Marines hiked through the wilderness for 3 days and came up on the base from the undefended rear. They planted charges on the geothermal power plant that ran everything. When it exploded, the entire base lost power and life support. The Creathians had to evacuate, and the Coalition took the planet without losing a single soldier. Dr. Karen Wells kept analyzing Creathian biology and finding weaknesses. She discovered that their sensitive hearing made certain sound frequencies painful. She developed sonic weapons that human ships could use to disorient Creathian crews. She found that their exoskeletons were vulnerable to extreme cold. Ryan's Marines started using cryo-weapons in ground combat with devastating effect. The Creathian forces in the Outer Rim began to fear the humans. They called them the Ghost Warriors who fought without honor. Creathian officers started refusing to engage human ships, knowing it would likely be a trap. General Vorath, the Creathian field commander in the sector, became obsessed with destroying Jake's task force. He saw the humans as a stain on the noble art of warfare. General Vorath was a decorated warrior with 40 years of service. He had won hundreds of battles using traditional Creathian tactics. He could not understand how these primitive humans were defeating his forces. They ran away instead of fighting. They attacked weak points instead of testing themselves against strong enemies. They had no honor at all. It offended everything Vorath believed about warfare. He set a trap of his own using a supply convoy as bait. When Jake's ships moved to attack the convoy, 30 Creathian warships emerged from hiding and surrounded them. For the first time, the humans were outnumbered and outgunned with no escape route. Vorath broadcasted a message demanding Jake surrender and face honorable execution. Jake did something unexpected. He surrendered. He broadcasted his surrender message and powered down his weapons. The Creathian ships moved in to capture the human vessels. Then Jake triggered the real plan. His ships were... The war expanded rapidly over the next 6 months as human tactics spread throughout Coalition forces. Like wildfire, Jake Morrison was promoted to Commodore and given command of 40 human ships, now designated the Earth Expeditionary Fleet. What started as 4 destroyers in the Outer Rim had become a major force that the Coalition could no longer ignore or hide away. The victories kept coming, and with each victory the methods became more brutal. Admiral Kevin Price arrived from Earth with 20 additional warships and a reputation that made even Jake uncomfortable. Kevin was 55 years old and had commanded Earth's defense forces during the final years of the Mars Rebellion. He believed in total war doctrine where anything that helped you win was acceptable. Civilian infrastructure, supply lines, propaganda, psychological warfare, all of it was fair game in Kevin's view. When he met Jake for the first time, he made his philosophy clear. The only rule in war was to win. Lieutenant Amy Brooks was now Commander Brooks, and she led the newly formed Special Operations Division. Her job was to develop and implement the kind of tactics that regular coalition officers refused to even consider. Amy had gotten very good at thinking like a criminal instead of a soldier. She planned infiltration missions using captured enemy vessels. She created elaborate deception campaigns that made the Creathians see threats that did not exist. She was brilliant and ruthless, and she hated herself a little more each day. Dr. Karen Wells had expanded her research into weapons development. The sonic disruptors she created were now standard equipment on all human ships. She had also developed a biological agent that targeted Creathian immune systems. It would not kill them, but it would make them sick enough that they could not fight effectively. Karen presented the weapon to Jake and Admiral Price during a command meeting. Price wanted to deploy it immediately. Jake hesitated because using biological weapons crossed a line that felt too dangerous. The argument that followed revealed the growing divide in human command. Price believed the Creathians had started this war and deserved whatever happened to them. He pointed out that the Creathians had destroyed the Valorian homeworld and killed billions without mercy. Why should humanity fight with one hand tied behind its back? Jake argued that becoming monsters to fight monsters meant everyone lost regardless of who won the war. The meeting ended without resolution, and the biological weapon remained unused for now. Colonel Ryan Hayes had become a legend among both Coalition and Creathian forces. The Creathians called him the Ghost because his Marines could appear anywhere without warning and disappear just as quickly. Ryan led a mission to a Creathian fortress world called Drath Prime that everyone said was impossible to take. The fortress had defenses that could destroy an entire fleet. It had supplies to last 10 years. It controlled 3 jump gates that were vital for moving ships through that region of space. Ryan did not assault the fortress. Instead, his Marines spent 2 months infiltrating the civilian population on the planet. They disguised themselves as traders and workers. They gathered intelligence and made contacts with local resistance groups who hated the Creathian occupation. When everything was ready, Ryan's people poisoned the water supply going into the fortress. Not enough to kill anyone, but enough to make thousands of soldiers too sick to fight. Then the resistance attacked the power grid and communication systems, while Ryan's Marines blew up the ammunition depot. The fortress fell in 3 days, without the Coalition firing a single shot from orbit. The Creathian commander surrendered when he realized his position was hopeless. Admiral Vorath was furious when he heard about the operation. He issued orders that Ryan Hayes was to be executed on sight if captured. The Coalition Council debated whether to condemn the tactics, but ultimately stayed silent because Drath Prime was too important to give back. Commander Amy Brooks ran her own operation that pushed ethical boundaries even further. She had captured Creathian communication codes months earlier, and her team had been studying Creathian language and protocols. Amy realized they could impersonate Creathian commanders and send false orders to enemy fleets. She spent 3 weeks crafting the perfect deception. The Creathians had a major fleet gathering at the Torvin system, preparing to launch an offensive into Coalition space. Amy sent fake orders using captured codes that redirected half the fleet to a different system to respond to a supposed emergency. When those ships arrived at the empty system, they found only automated drones broadcasting distress signals. By the time they realized the deception and returned to Torvin, Coalition forces had attacked the weakened fleet left behind and destroyed it completely. The Creathians lost 140 ships because of Amy's trick. It was their worst single defeat in the entire war, but it also meant they could no longer trust their own communication systems. Creathian commanders started second-guessing every order they received. The paranoia spread through their military like poison. Amy watched the intelligence reports showing the chaos her deception had created and felt sick about how easy it had been. Empress Zarthera, the supreme ruler of the Creathian Empire, called an emergency session of her war council. She had ruled for 30 years and never faced defeat like this. The reports from the front were increasingly desperate. Human forces were winning engagements at impossible odds. They fought without honor and without predictability. Traditional Creathian tactics that had conquered a dozen species over centuries were useless against these new enemies. The Empress made a decree that shook both sides of the war. Humans were to be considered an extinction-level threat to the Krethian species. Any Krethian commander who encountered human forces was authorized to use any weapon available, including banned weapons of mass destruction. The rules that had governed galactic warfare for thousands of years no longer applied when fighting humans. If the humans wanted total war, they would get it. Admiral Kevin Price saw the Krethian decree as an opportunity rather than a threat. He proposed a preemptive strike on Krethian industrial worlds before they could deploy their worst weapons. Jake opposed the plan in a heated command meeting that nearly ended in physical confrontation. Striking industrial centers meant killing millions of civilians. It was exactly the kind of atrocity that made the Krethians evil. Becoming like them was not victory. Price argued that the Krethians had made their choice by authorizing weapons of mass destruction. Waiting for them to strike first was suicide. He had the support of half the human commanders present. Jake had the support of the other half. Ambassador Lisa Grant intervened and said the decision would be made by the Coalition Council, not by human commanders alone. Price accepted that, but everyone knew he was planning something regardless of what politicians decided. The psychological warfare campaign expanded under Admiral Price's direction. Human ships began broadcasting propaganda directly to Krethian vessels. The messages explained that their empress was leading them to extinction. They told Krethian soldiers that surrender meant survival while continued fighting meant death. They showed footage of destroyed Krethian ships and bases. They created fear and doubt where there had been certainty and honor. Some Krethian crews began to defect. It started with just a few ships whose commanders saw the writing on the wall. Then it became dozens. The Empress ordered the execution of any commander who even considered surrender. That just made more Krethians want to defect. The rigid honor culture that had made them strong for centuries was cracking under pressure from an enemy who ignored all the rules. Dr. Wells discovered that Krethian ships used a central computer system that had a specific vulnerability. If you knew the right access codes, you could hack into the system and disable critical functions. Amy's team had captured those codes from a disabled ship months earlier. They developed a virus that could spread through Krethian networks and shut down weapon systems, life support, or engine controls. Jake refused to authorize the use of the virus on occupied ships because shutting down life support was murder. But he approved using it to disable weapons during combat. The first time they deployed it, a Krethian battleship found all its weapons offline in the middle of a battle. The crew panicked and abandoned ship thinking there was a catastrophic malfunction. 3 more ships in that fleet surrendered immediately rather than risk the same fate. The Coalition captured 4 capital ships without destroying them. General Vorath personally led a counter-offensive aimed directly at human forces. He assembled 200 ships and came looking for Commodore Morrison's fleet. Vorath wanted to prove that Krethian strength and honor could still defeat human trickery. He challenged Jake to open battle with no deceptions, just warrior against warrior. It was the kind of challenge that Krethian culture valued above everything. Jake ignored the challenge completely. Instead of meeting Vorath's fleet head-on, he split his forces and attacked 3 different Krethian supply lines simultaneously. While Vorath searched for Jake's main fleet in empty space, human ships destroyed depot after depot, leaving Krethian forces across 2 sectors without ammunition or fuel. Vorath's fleet eventually had to retreat because they were running out of supplies themselves. The humiliation broke something in General Vorath. He requested permission from the Empress to use chemical weapons on human. Captain Nicole Sanders arrived in the war zone with a mission that made everyone uncomfortable. She was a journalist from Earth sent to document human military operations for the people back home. Nicole was 38 years old and had covered conflicts across human space for 15 years, but nothing prepared her for what she was about to witness. The Earth government wanted the public to see their military heroes in action. What Nicole found instead was something much darker. She was assigned to the EDSF Defiance and given full access to Commodore Jake Morrison and his command staff. Jake did not want a journalist watching everything they did, but Ambassador Lisa Grant insisted. The people of Earth needed to understand what their military was doing in their name. Nicole started recording interviews and observing operations immediately. Within 3 days, she regretted accepting this assignment. The first operation Nicole witnessed was a raid on a Krethian supply convoy. Commander Amy Brooks planned it with cold precision. Human ships intercepted the convoy and demanded surrender. When the Krethian commander refused, Amy ordered an attack that targeted the engines and life support systems. The enemy ships were left drifting in space with crews slowly suffocating. Amy then broadcasted a message to other nearby Krethian vessels. Surrender immediately or watch your comrades die slowly. Nicole recorded the whole thing and felt sick. 3 Krethian ships surrendered to save the dying crews. Amy's tactic worked perfectly from a military standpoint, but Nicole could not stop thinking about those crews suffocating while their commanders debated surrender terms. She asked Amy how she could do something so cruel. Amy looked at her with tired eyes and asked how many coalition civilians had died because commanders hesitated to use effective tactics. Nicole had no answer for that. Admiral Kevin Price was even worse. Nicole interviewed him about his strategic philosophy, and he spoke openly about total war. Price believed that every Krethian resource was a valid target. Factories, power plants, food production, water treatment facilities, all of it should be destroyed to weaken enemy capability. When Nicole asked about civilian casualties, Price shrugged and said the Krethians should have thought about that before starting a war of extermination. Colonel Ryan Hayes took Nicole with his Marines on a ground operation. They were hitting a Krethian communication hub on a contested planet. The mission was supposed to be surgical and precise. What Nicole saw instead was Marines using flamethrowers to clear buildings and planting explosives with no regard for collateral damage. Ryan explained that speed and overwhelming force saved lives by ending fights quickly. Nicole watched a building collapse and wondered how many people were inside. Dr. Karen Wells showed Nicole the weapons research laboratory. Karen spoke enthusiastically about new developments in chemical agents and biological warfare. She had refined the immune system disruptor to be more effective, and was working on variants that could target specific Krethian genetic markers. Nicole asked if Karen had any ethical concerns about creating weapons that specifically targeted one species. Karen said she had lots of concerns, but dead concerns did not stop the enemy from killing people. After 2 weeks embedded with human forces, Nicole had more than enough material. She sent her first report back to Earth, and it caused an immediate firestorm. The public saw footage of suffocating Krethian crews and burning buildings. They heard human officers talking casually about targeting civilians and developing biological weapons. Opinion on Earth split dramatically. Some people said the military was doing what was necessary. Others said humanity was becoming the monsters they were supposed to be fighting. Jake called Nicole to his ready room after her report went public. He was angry but also looked exhausted. He asked her if she felt good about undermining the war effort while people were dying to protect Earth. Nicole said she was just showing the truth. Jake told her the truth was more complicated than what a camera could capture. Every brutal tactic she documented had saved lives by ending battles faster. Every moral compromise was made because the alternative was extinction. Nicole asked Jake a question that neither of them could answer. At what point did survival stop being worth the cost? Jake stared out the window at the stars for a long time before saying he did not know anymore. He had started this war believing he was protecting humanity. Now he was not sure if the humanity he was protecting was worth saving. The conversation ended with both of them feeling worse than before. The Coalition Council received intelligence that changed everything. The Krethians were preparing to deploy weapons of mass destruction against 3 major Coalition worlds. The target list included the Centauri home system, where the Coalition headquarters was located. If the attack succeeded, it would kill 12 billion people and destroy the Coalition's political center. They had 4 days to stop it or evacuate populations that large, which was impossible. Admiral Kevin Price immediately proposed a preemptive strike on the Krethian industrial worlds. Destroy their weapons manufacturing capacity before they could deploy the weapons. Jake opposed the plan just as strongly as before. The industrial worlds had massive civilian populations. Millions would die in the strikes. Price argued that 12 billion Coalition citizens mattered more than a few million Krethian civilians. The math was simple. Ambassador Lisa Grant and Elder Taven argued for hours in emergency council sessions. Half the Coalition species supported Price's plan because their own worlds were on the target list. The other half said authorizing attacks on civilian populations made them as bad as the Krethians. Taven warned that once this line was crossed, there would be no going back. The galaxy would descend into total warfare where nothing was forbidden. Jake found himself in an impossible position. He commanded the fleet that would carry out the strike if it was authorized. His own conscience screamed that mass civilian casualties were wrong regardless of justification. but his duty was to protect Earth and the Coalition. If those weapons hit Centauri Prime, the war was essentially lost. He had 48 hours to decide what he believed was right. Commander Amy Brooks came to him with another option. Her intelligence teams had located the Crethean weapons storage facility. It was in a remote system far from civilian populations. If they could destroy the facility before the weapons were deployed, they could stop the attack without mass casualties. The problem was the facility was protected by the largest Crethean fleet ever assembled, over 300 warships. Jake asked if she thought they could actually succeed against those odds. Amy said probably not, but it was better than becoming the kind of people who murdered millions of civilians. Jake agreed and started planning an operation that would likely get them all killed. Admiral Price was furious when he heard about it, and went directly to the Coalition Council demanding they overrule Jake and authorize the industrial strikes. The council split right down the middle. 8 species voted for Price's plan, and 8 voted for Jake's plan. The deciding vote belonged to Elder Taven, who had been silent throughout the debate. Taven stood and gave a speech about the soul of civilization. He said that if the Coalition authorized mass civilian casualties to save themselves, they would prove the Cretheans right about everything. The galaxy would just be tribes killing each other with no moral foundation. He voted for Jake's plan, knowing it might doom them all. Nicole. Sanders recorded everything and sent another report to Earth. The public watched their military, split between pragmatic brutality and suicidal idealism. Support for the war effort began to fracture as people debated which approach was correct. Some wanted Price to lead because he was willing to do whatever it took to win. Others wanted Jake because he still tried to maintain some moral standards even when it cost them. Jake assembled his fleet for what everyone expected to be a suicide mission. He had 60 ships against 300, and they needed to fight through to destroy a heavily fortified weapons facility. The odds were impossible, but Jake refused to authorize killing millions of civilians. He addressed his fleet and explained what they were attempting. He gave every captain the chance to refuse the mission. Not a single ship declined. The battle plan Amy developed was the most complex operation human forces had attempted. They would attack from 4 different vectors simultaneously to divide the enemy fleet. Half the ships were decoys loaded with drones and electronic warfare systems to make the Cretheans think they faced a larger force. The real strike team would use every dirty trick they had learned to punch through the defenses. Meanwhile, Admiral Price took matters into his own hands. He had been planning for this possibility ever since the council meeting started. Price took 20 ships loyal to him and left the fleet without authorization. He set course for the nearest Crethean industrial world. If the council would not authorize the pragmatic strike, then Price would do it himself and accept the consequences later. He believed he was saving the Coalition even if they were too weak to save themselves. Commander Amy Brooks discovered Price's desertion 2 hours after he left. She immediately informed Jake, who tried to recall Price and his ships. Price refused all communication and continued toward his target. Jake was faced with another impossible choice. He could split his already outnumbered fleet to stop Price, or he could con. The aftermath of Admiral Kevin Price's unauthorized bombardment created a crisis that threatened to tear the Coalition apart. Jake Morrison formally charged Price with war crimes and demanded his arrest, but Price refused to surrender. 20 human ships loyal to Price formed a rogue fleet that operated outside Coalition command. Price believed he had saved billions of lives by destroying Crethean war production, and he was willing to face any tribunal after the war was won. Half the Coalition species wanted Price executed immediately, while the other half quietly agreed with his actions, even if they could not say so. Publicly, Commander Amy Brooks worked around the clock trying to locate Price's fleet, but he had learned from the best. Price used every trick Amy had ever taught him about hiding and misdirection. His ships would appear long enough to hit another Crethean target, then vanish into deep space. Over 3 weeks, Price destroyed 4 more industrial facilities, killing millions more civilians. The Crethean war machine was crippling under the assault, but the moral cost was staggering. Empress Zarthera watched her empire crumbling and made a decision that surprised everyone. She sent a secret communication to Ambassador Lisa Grant requesting negotiation terms. The message was carefully worded to avoid seeming weak, but the intent was clear. The Cretheans were ready to discuss ending the war. Lisa brought the message to the Coalition Council, and a heated debate followed that lasted for 2 days. Elder Tyven argued passionately for accepting negotiations. The war was won militarily, so why continue the bloodshed? Other species wanted unconditional surrender and war crime trials for Krethian leaders. Some wanted the Krethian Empire completely dismantled and their species scattered across the galaxy. The debate revealed how much hatred had built up over 12 years of brutal warfare. Jake attended the council sessions and watched species that claimed to value honor and civilization call for genocide. Nicole Sanders published her final report about the war, and it caused political chaos on Earth. She had footage of everything from suffocating Krethian crews to the burning factories on Heston Major. The public watched their military transform from defenders into something darker. Opinion polls showed Earth's population split almost evenly between those who supported the military's methods and those who wanted immediate withdrawal from the war. The Earth government faced massive protests from both sides. Captain Nicole had interviewed hundreds of soldiers and officers during her time in the war zone. She included those interviews in her report. Young Marines talked about nightmares and guilt. Ship captains explained how they justified each compromise with survival and duty. Nicole showed Dr. Karen Wells crying while describing the weapons she had created. She showed Colonel Ryan Hayes drinking alone in his quarters, unable to sleep. The report humanized the people fighting, but also showed the terrible cost they were paying mentally and morally. Jake received orders from Earth to return home and testify before the government about military operations. He knew it was political theater designed to assign blame before the next election. Part of him wanted to refuse and stay with his fleet, but Commander Amy convinced him to go. Someone needed to explain to the civilians what war actually meant. Someone needed to make them understand that judging from safety was easy, while making life and death decisions under fire was impossible. Before Jake left for Earth, he received another message from Empress Zarthera. This one was addressed to him personally. She asked to meet face-to-face to discuss surrender terms. The Empress said she would only negotiate with human representatives because humans were the only ones who understood what this war had become. Every other species in the coalition still believed in honor and rules. Humans knew the truth that survival was all that mattered. Jake agreed to the meeting despite knowing it could be a trap. The meeting took place on a neutral station in unclaimed space. Jake brought Commander Amy and a security team. Empress Zarthera arrived with 2 advisors and her own guards. She was 3 meters tall with 4 arms and an exoskeleton that bore scars from personal combat. She looked at Jake with eyes that held intelligence and exhaustion in equal measure. They talked for 6 hours about terms and conditions, but really they were talking about what both species had lost in this war. Zarthera explained that Krethian culture was built on warrior honor and martial tradition going back thousands of years. They had conquered a dozen species using the same tactics and codes that had always worked. Then humans arrived and ignored all the rules. Every time Krethian commanders thought they understood human tactics, humans did something new and unexpected. It was like fighting ghosts who had no honor and no predictability. The psychological effect on Krethian warriors had been devastating. Jake told her about the coalition being pushed to the edge of extinction. He explained that humanity joined a war they did not start to defend allies who needed help. Earth had no choice but to use every advantage available, because losing meant watching billions die. He did not apologize for human tactics, but he also did not pretend they were honorable or clean. Both leaders acknowledged that this war had brought out the worst in everyone involved. The surrender terms they negotiated were surprisingly reasonable. The Krethian Empire would be reduced in size but not eliminated. War crime trials would prosecute individuals on both sides who committed atrocities. Reparations would be paid over 50 years to rebuild destroyed worlds. Most importantly, both species would exchange military observers and cultural ambassadors to prevent future misunderstandings. Zarthera wanted her people to learn how humans fought, so they would never be caught unprepared again. Jake wanted the Krethians to understand that human ruthlessness came from desperation, not cruelty. The Coalition Council initially rejected the terms as too lenient. Elder Taven led the faction demanding harsher punishment for the Krethians. Jake stood before the council and gave a speech that would define his legacy. He said that crushing the Krethians completely would just create another war in 20 years when they rebuilt and sought revenge. The galaxy needed peace, not continued cycles of violence. He also pointed out that human tactics had already changed galactic warfare forever. Every species now knew that honor and rules were optional when survival was at stake. That knowledge could not be unlearned. Ambassador Lisa Grant used every political connection she had built over 6 years to push the surrender terms through. The final vote was close, but it passed. The Crethean Empire would survive in reduced form and the war would officially end. The announcement triggered celebrations across Coalition space, but also anger from those who wanted total victory. Admiral Kevin Price sent a message condemning the surrender terms as weakness that would lead to future war. Jake returned to Earth to face government hearings about military conduct during the war. The hearings lasted 3 months and were broadcast across human space. Politicians asked him to justify every controversial tactic and every civilian death. Jake answered honestly about his decisions and accepted responsibility for the consequences. He explained that war forced impossible choices where every option had terrible costs. He refused to claim that human tactics were morally right, only that they were effective and necessary given the circumstances. Nicole Sanders testified at the hearings about what she witnessed. She described the brutality and moral compromises in detail. She also described the dedication and sacrifice of soldiers who believed they were protecting humanity. Nicole told the politicians that it was easy to judge from comfortable offices, but the people doing the fighting deserved better than simplistic moral condemnations. War was hell and pretending otherwise was intellectual cowardice. The hearings ended with mixed conclusions. Some politicians called for restricting military authority and implementing stricter rules of engagement. Others argued for expanded military autonomy because civilian oversight could not respond fast enough in combat situations. The debate would continue for years, but immediately it resulted in Jake being quietly retired from active service. The government wanted him gone because he was too controversial and reminded people of uncomfortable truths about what winning required. Admiral Kevin Price was never caught. His rogue fleet continued operating in the outer territories for another year, hitting remaining Crethean military targets. Eventually, the Crethean surrender made his operations pointless and Price disappeared completely. Rumors said he took his ships beyond explored space to find new frontiers. Other rumors said he was assassinated by Coalition intelligence. The truth was never confirmed, but Price became a legend among certain military circles who believed he did what was necessary without hesitation. Commander Amy Brooks was promoted to admiral and given the task of reforming Coalition military doctrine. She spent the next 5 years developing new tactical frameworks that incorporated human innovations while trying to maintain ethical boundaries. Amy worked with military leaders from every species to create rules of engagement that acknowledged modern realities while preventing total moral collapse. It was difficult work because everyone had different ideas about where lines should be drawn. Colonel Ryan Hayes received every HFY medal the Coalition could award and then was quietly retired just like Jake. His methods were too brutal for peacetime service even